Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy to take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day. On this episode, we'll get an update on Turkey from Alper Coşkun. But before we get into that, let's take a look at some of the biggest foreign policy trends that have been going on in the past few weeks.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
All right, well, I guess he's not that new anymore, since this is like the third time that we've done this new co-hosting thing. But Tristen, welcome back in. How are things going in England? Is it starting to get sunny there?
It is. It is actually the first really proper sunny day here, and it feels fantastic. Nonetheless, I'm inside recording this with you. So,
Yeah, those birds chirping in the background are too much of a distraction for our listeners. Yeah, we finally got some nice weather here in DC, and we're getting towards that sweet spot of a few weeks of loveliness before it just turns into a swamp and gets oppressingly humid and hot, which I'm not looking forward to, but I'll enjoy this while I can get it. So,
well, absolutely. And before we go out to enjoy brief moments of sunshine, obviously there's an awful lot going on in the world that is anything but sunny. So let's jump into it. What do we have on the docket today?
yeah, so I mentioned my interview with Alper Coşkun, where we're going to talk about Turkey and the latest political developments that are going on there, and the arrest of the mayor of Istanbul and what that means for elections and just democracy writ large in Turkey. We had a really good conversation on that. So looking forward to listeners being able to hear that. But before we dive into that, we're going to discuss the renewed fighting in Gaza. Greenland is in the news again and probably not going away anytime soon if the current U.S. administration has anything to say about it. But we're going to talk a little bit about Greenland, what's going on there and what it means sort of more broadly, which is the bigger issue. And you and I will get into that. And then we're going to look at actually a good news story at India's return to the global rice market. And I'll explain why that's important when we get into it. But yeah, lots of stuff to cover today.
All right, so let's jump in with our update on Gaza. Last month, the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, broke the ceasefire with Hamas with a series of airstrikes across Gaza. Soon after, Israeli forces recaptured areas, including the strategic Netzarim corridor, which is the corridor that divides the north and south of the Strip. The first day of Israel's renewed airstrikes alone killed over 400 Gazans, with Gaza's death toll now exceeding 50,000 people. In total, more than 120,000 Gazans have been forced to flee their homes since the ceasefire collapsed. And it's on top of this, we absolutely must note that the latest attacks have killed 2 journalists, including Al Jazeera reporter Hossam Shabat, bringing the total journalists and media worker deaths in Gaza to 206. And beyond journalists, over a dozen international humanitarian workers have been killed in this latest escalation. In one case last month, an Israeli tank fired on a UN compound, killing a Bulgarian staff member. And as a result, the UN has withdrawn nearly a third of its international personnel from Gaza, where over 280 staff have been killed as a result of this war. So things are kicking off again. It looks like we are back into being in a terrible situation. Kelly, how did we get back here?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I think you're right when you discuss the issue of us being back into a horrible situation again. I'll just get to the bottom line up front. I don't see things getting better anytime soon. I see this as the beginning of a continuation of fighting once again in Gaza. And I think it's important to remember as well, just to kind of recap what's been going on. The original ceasefire deal that was signed in January was always very fragile to begin with. And it was a multi-part ceasefire. And this first 6-week period was the part of the ceasefire that was the most spelled out. And everybody kind of figured that they would get through that. Hopefully, if they were going to get through anything, they would be able to get through that first 6 weeks, as long as each side released prisoners and exchanged prisoners and hostages. So it's also important to remember that the ceasefire was signed right before the Trump administration came into power in mid-January. So a lot of this, I think, was Netanyahu giving an early win to Trump and trying to better that relationship. It's a strong relationship, sort of giving him a win so that Trump would then allow him to do certain things moving forward. So over the course of the 6 weeks, though, there was a lot of prisoners released and also hostages released. Hamas released 33 hostages. Israel freed over 2,000 Palestinian prisoners. There were some Israeli strikes that continued that killed some folks again in Gaza, but it was nothing like what had been going on beforehand. Israel throughout this and Hamas have not been able to get together to deal with the later stages of the agreement and figure out exactly what's going to happen with that and talk about different stages of Israeli withdrawal or what sort of border crossings are going to be open or closed and things like that. The really tricky, sticky points of the ceasefire in the first place. And as the ceasefire wound down, I think there's a couple of things to remember here. One was Hamas, in one exchange, released bodies of deceased hostages. They released one body that wasn't the actual hostage, which really infuriated Israelis. And then there was also periods when they were marching hostages through crowds of Hamas fighters and things like that, that really infuriated the Israelis. On the other side, I think it's important to remember, obviously the attacks of October 7th were horrible. A response was called for, but in many ways, the reason this war has gone on so long and gone the way it has is because this is almost as much about domestic politics in Israel as it is fighting a war against Hamas and in Gaza. And at this point, Netanyahu is trying to do everything he can to placate the far right, hard right members of his cabinet so that he can remain prime minister, so he doesn't have these political charges that are against him, these legal charges that are against him. And you continue to see him doing things like trying to fire the head of Shin Bet, the domestic security service, which has never happened before, which is supposedly someone who's hands off, but again, trying to make moves to throw blame somewhere else for October 7th or placate the hard right members of his cabinet. And I think, we're doing a working group on this right now at ISD where we bring together academics, think tankers, practitioners to talk about these kind of issues. And we're looking specifically at Gaza and the ripple effects and the aftershocks from Gaza. And a real big question moving forward is just taking out the domestic political situation on the Israeli side for a second, which is really hard to do, I understand. But this is part of what we kind of view as a bigger crumbling of the order in the Middle East, which also falls into sort of the larger crumbling of the international order. And we're seeing that at a regional scale in the Middle East. And we've seen the security strategy and how Israel goes about its strategic security being upended with October 7th. That is no longer feasible. This idea of like we can coexist with Hamas, we're safe, there's no real threats like before, and those days are over. So the big question is, how do they advance from this? And do they try to become more of a hegemonic power in the Middle East with American backing from the Trump administration, or do they preemptively try to carve out buffer areas without really trying to deal more with the region as a whole? I think time will tell, but it's definitely going to be a more aggressive posture than it has been over the past decade or so. And that's what we're seeing now. And the domestic political situation's making it worse.
Absolutely. And all this suggests that this isn't going to end anytime soon.
Yeah, and that's the sad part. All right, moving to our next story. The U.S. Vice President, JD Vance, and his wife, Usha Vance, visited Greenland along with National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. I imagine they were not coordinating their travel plans via Signal on this one, but they did go to Greenland last Friday. And this is amidst all of this rhetoric and threatening language from the Trump administration about annexing Greenland, saying the U.S. could actually use military force to do so. Trump has been talking up Greenland and the critical minerals there, the oil there, its importance for Arctic security, been saying that Denmark has not been doing a good job on governing and helping out Greenland over the years, and that it's underinvested in the security and all these different things. Really talking a big game on Greenland. So, Tristen, I know that the second lady was originally going to go on her own and visit some dog sled races and things like that, but the Greenlanders weren't having that. So JD Vance joined her and they just went and visited a Space Force base. So, as someone whose country of origin is also under threat of annexation, what is an outsider's view on this? Where do the Greenlanders, the folks in NATO and EU and Denmark, how do we see this?
Well, look, there are a few angles to this story that I think we really need to pay some attention to. Of course, there is the specific focus on Greenland itself, and American interest in Greenland isn't new. It's something that actually has taken a pause since the end of the Second World War. But prior to that, there were open discussions about whether or not the U.S. could annex Greenland. The U.S. Secretary of State William Seward, who negotiated the purchase of Alaska, also proposed a study taking Greenland, and that was back in 1868. Of course, during the Second World War, the U.S. did occupy Greenland. Viewing it is crucial to North American security. And Harry Truman proposed purchasing the island for $100 million in gold, and this didn't obviously pan out. But, what we see now is a return to discussions, more than just open musings about the U.S. taking control of Greenland for reasons of both security as well as economic gain. Again, this is in and of itself interesting and significant, but, stepping back as a historian and as an international relations theorist, what's really significant to me here is that we see a return to a style of politics, of strong-arm diplomacy that we have not seen since certainly the end of the Second World War, and really a style of international politics that is not out of place in the 19th century and even the earlier 20th century. And so, this is yet another data point that we can look to as we consider what the end of this current world order in which we have otherwise been living, what it means.
Yeah, and you and I are definitely drinking from the same Kool-Aid on this topic as far as what it means for the broader international order. And I think it makes for a more dangerous world when you talk about annexation and gaining territory and things like this, and having the former guarantor of a world where that kind of thing doesn't happen, being one of the leading advocates for it, speaks to how this is speeding up and how we may be moving into a era and an order that allows for spheres of influence, for outright taking of territory. And I think where this fits into Russia-Ukraine as well is the fact that this same Trump administration seems to be, although Trump was saying some threatening things to President Putin this weekend, still, on the face of it, it seems to be conversations that are trying to integrate Russia back into the world order while allowing them probably to take territory in Ukraine. And we're just being like, all right, you take the territory you want, and maybe we'll take Greenland, maybe we'll take Panama. And you've got folks like Paul Kagame in Rwanda who are outwardly taking territory from the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, that are rich in minerals and pretending that he's not doing it. So when the United States does it and allows Russia and others to get away with it, it opens the door for this to happen on a broader scale, which is very scary for conflict and things moving forward.
Absolutely. There is that permissive effect. And let's add to this list Taiwan. If I were sitting in Taipei right now, I would be watching this very, very closely, and in not a way that doesn't come with much trepidation.
Yeah, because when Donald Trump, which I'm sure he was briefed the first administration on what a defense of Taiwan would actually take and entail and how severe that military conflict would be and what it would mean for loss of life on the American side, I'm not so sure he would defend Taiwan and would not potentially look for some sort of deal with China on that. So that's the world we're living in at the moment.
It is, and the kinds of conversations that we're having, like this very one, is one that I never imagined 20 years ago, let alone even a couple of months ago, we would be having. And yet, here we are. Moving now to our third story. We're going to look at India's liberalization of its rice exports. India is lifting its remaining restrictions on rice exports, opening up all of its rice now for export. India previously banned exports of what's called broken rice or fragmented rice grains in September of 2022 when the Russia-Ukraine war broke out and fears raised of a shortfall in the grain. India is the world's largest rice exporter and is expected to account for around 40% of the global rice market between September 2024 and October of 2025. And already at a record high rice production, India plans to now double its agricultural and food good exports to $100 billion by 2030. So this is a big story for India, but it's also a big story for then the knock-on effects on other countries. Kelly?
Yeah, so there's a couple reasons I wanted to include this story this week. One, I realized that we only really ever talk about really bad things. So it's nice to have something fairly decent to talk about in the news. And another reason is we did a working group on this. I have a lot of plugs to our working groups today, and we didn't necessarily plan that, but we did a working group on food security and conflict back in the spring of 2021. And I'm actually going up to Yale tomorrow morning to talk at a food security conference about these issues. So I got really deep into food security conflict as something that's important for national security back in 2021 and have continued to look at that topic over this time period. And as you note, this is really a big deal because when India stopped exporting different types of rice in 2022 in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it really spiked food prices. There's a lot of African countries that get the majority of their rice from India. Things like that made it a lot harder to purchase those things and those staple crops for people that needed it, and really increased food insecurity across the board there. And I think something to keep in mind when we're thinking about this is you mentioned the war in Ukraine and India stopping its exportation of rice in 2022 in response to that. Let me back up a little bit. And the reason that freaked out the Indians a little bit more than it might have is because of COVID. And during COVID, we saw that we are really living in a world that unfortunately has very tight supply chains on everything, including food. And we get a lot of our staple crops from just a few different places around the globe that are at risk of multiple different issues happening that could stop the flow of those goods, whether it be storms or drought or war or things that shut down supply chains where you just can't produce goods, whatever. So in COVID, we saw a lot of these shutdowns and things affected the transport and supply chains of food. And that got a lot of countries thinking about food protectionism and ensuring where their food was coming from. If they were a major exporter, maybe they thought maybe we shouldn't export so much so we can be sure to feed our own population. And then when the war in Ukraine hit in 2022, if we recall, Ukraine and that portion of Russia are major exporters of wheat and grain and food crops as well. So that caused a spike in food prices and supply chain shutdowns and closures and difficulties on where things were coming from. So India saw this after having gone through COVID and said, wait a second, we need to make sure we have enough food here for our own population and put a clamp down on the exporting of a lot of this rice. So there's a fear of this happening more broadly, right? Food protectionism is not a good thing. What we need to do is expand what types of things we produce and eat so that we're not beholden to just one or two or three different types of foods. And that way it can expand where we get food from, and we don't have to worry about this type of food protectionism. So that's kind of where this comes from. But the fact that they have lifted these now is a good thing, should drop the price of food globally, especially for some of these staple crops that are so important in some of the developing areas. And yeah, just a good news story that I wanted to highlight this week.
Well, we'll take the good news where we can find it right now.
That we will. All right. Now moving on to our deep dive for this week, we're going to talk to Alper Coşkun. Alper is a senior fellow in the Europe program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. His research focuses on Turkish foreign policy, especially in relation to the United States and Europe. He is a retired career diplomat of 32 years with extensive experience in both bilateral and multilateral settings. He was the Director General for International Security Affairs at the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs from 2016 to 2019, covering NATO, transatlantic relations, and Euro-Atlantic security defense and arms control disarmament matters. Before that, he was ambassador to Azerbaijan from 2012 to 2016, where he oversaw one of Turkey's largest diplomatic missions. Let's listen in to the conversation. Welcome back to Headlines in History, folks. And today I'm excited to be joined for the second time by Alper Coşkun to talk to us about Turkey. He was on over a year ago to talk about Turkey and its involvement in NATO and in the Russia-Ukraine war and things like that. But today he's going to talk to us about what's going on inside Turkey politically. So Alper, thanks for joining us once again.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So let's just get to it. What is happening politically right now in Turkey? I know that that's why we brought you on. So yeah, what happened recently?
Right. We're seeing massive street protests. This came after the detention of Istanbul's popular mayor, who's an opposition figure. And this basically started a while ago for some time now. And this individual, it's important to put it into context. He is an opposition figure, but he represents the greatest political challenge to Erdogan, maybe the largest that he's seen since he's been in power for 20 plus years, in the sense that this is a young maverick politician. He's with the center-left opposition CHP, but he's not the typical social democrat type of guy. He has the ability to appeal to larger crowds. He is pious, so he's able to appeal also to the conservative electorate, which is almost an anomaly, if you will, for the center-left political party in Turkey. And he is also appealing to the Kurdish voters because he's been able to build a sense of trust with them. He's very successful in his personal engagement and his style, very strong communication skills. So he was really a rising star, and he successfully defeated Erdogan 4 times in Istanbul. 3 of those were when he was running as a candidate for mayor of Istanbul. And Erdogan has famously stated that to win Turkey, you really need to win in Istanbul. So he sort of turned that statement on the top of its head by defeating Erdogan and the governing AKP twice. And in that sense, he represented a significant political challenge for Erdogan. And, you know, for the opposition, he represented the hope that through democratic processes, he could bring change to the country. Now, for some time now, we had been seeing an increasing amount of pressure on the Istanbul municipality, which he runs. There were a lot of charges being brought against different municipalities and also the Istanbul municipality itself. And there were clear signs that something was bubbling and something was about to happen. On March 18, something unrelated to what I just mentioned happened. The Istanbul University, from which the mayor had graduated years ago, rescinded his diploma. There had been talk preceding this that his diploma was fake and so on and so forth. All these allegations were put into the media stream. And then the university took the decision to rescind his diploma. In effect, what that means is by the Constitution, you have to have a university diploma to run as a candidate to become president. So it will go to the appeals process and so on. But that is just another signal as to the game that is unfolding, basically, in Turkey, if you will. A day after that, I mentioned some of these charges that were being brought against him. He was detained. Imamoglu with him and more than 100 people that work with the CHP, with the opposition party, and are members of the municipalities in Istanbul. They were arrested on different charges. Excuse me, he was detained, not arrested. The charges brought against him were twofold: corruption and terrorism-related charges. And that immediately triggered an outpour of foul play calls from the opposition, but mainly an organic street protest movement developed as well, led by university students, including the university that rescinded his diploma. The governor's office declared these to be unlawful, and they advised people not to go to the streets. The opposition party hesitated a little bit initially, but then they expressed their full support to people coming out on the streets. And it grew organically to hundreds of thousands of people protesting on the streets. And this reached a peak when on the 23rd of March, just a couple of days after his detention, İmamoğlu was arrested on corruption charges. They dropped the terrorism charges in an odd fashion that legal experts say is just unheard and unseen of, because the comment that was made by the prosecutor's office was, since İmamoğlu has been charged on corruption charges, for the time being, we do not see a need to pursue these charges, which is the furthest. It's not a legal explanation. It's not a
Right.
legal explanation
Well,
at
it
all.
speaks to the fuzzy nature of it all to begin with.
Absolutely. Now, one thing important happened, and this is where I think the opposition played its hand quite smartly. First, they've managed to keep the masses away from violence. There have been spikes here and there. There have been some wrongdoings that always happen in these types of events. But I think overall, they've been able to control the crowd and keep the momentum, something that was a test for the opposition and the leader of the opposition party, who had never performed under such a circumstance. So in that sense, I think the opposition passed the test. But they made an interesting call. They decided after İmamoğlu was arrested to hold the primaries that would declare him to be the candidate for the upcoming presidential election, which is currently slated to take place in 2028, unless there are early elections. This was their way, I think, of saying to Erdogan and everyone else that we will not let anyone else decide who our candidate will be, even if you imprison him. And the turnout, this was a risk. It was a bit of a gamble. The turnout was phenomenal. What the CHP, the opposition party, did is they called not only their own party members who normally vote in the primaries, but they invited everyone, whoever wanted to show support, to come and vote. And around 15 million people voted for İmamoğlu to be the candidate of the CHP in the upcoming presidential elections. To put it into context, I just looked at the US primaries numbers last year. 35 million people voted in the US primaries. This is a country of 340 million. Turkey's 85 million. So if you correlate that, it's a
Yeah, it's a huge
significant
number.
number.
Yeah.
It's a very significant number. So that's basically where we are now. He's been arrested along with many other figures. Street protests are ongoing. There's a very severe clampdown that is taking place. Huge obstacles, physical obstacles, metro stations being closed down, roads being blocked. Pretty harsh attitude on the part of the police, arresting journalists. Today, a BBC journalist was deported from Turkey simply for reporting what's ongoing. So it's not a pretty picture that we're seeing, but I think this organic show of solidarity with İmamoğlu and the opposition is something that was not expected by the governing party and by the AKP.
Yeah, just one clarifying question. You mentioned that he had defeated Erdogan in Istanbul, but not Erdogan himself, the Erdogan party, correct?
That's correct. I should
Yeah.
have been more clear on that. Absolutely. But there's something interesting about that. Absolutely. Erdogan was not running. Erdogan was the president at the time. And in the previous elections, he was the prime minister. But Erdogan went to the streets during those elections, campaigning for the AK Party, the governing candidate. And it was seen by everyone, which is why I expressed it in that manner, as actually a competition between İmamoğlu and Erdogan. But practically, there were other candidates in question. That's right.
And Erdogan obviously was famously also the mayor of Istanbul and got his beginnings there. So, there's been a lot of democratic backsliding in Turkey over the past few decades, especially post 2016 as well, when there was the coup attempt. You mentioned that the election isn't until 2028. Obviously, he really fears İmamoğlu and his power, arresting him, 3.5 years or 3 years at least before the next election. Where are we with Turkey as a democracy at this point?
Well, this is really another threshold in the wrong direction. I think, it's a further descent of Turkey's democratic backsliding. There's no doubt about that. You mentioned it, and you're right. We've seen backsliding in the rule of law, in the independence of the judiciary and separation of powers particularly after Turkey transitioned into an executive presidential system. Real problems in terms of the space for freedom of expression, a lot of challenges for journalism and in the media space that is overwhelmingly now dominated by government-supported and financed private enterprises. So you've basically seen journalists who used to be mainstream, objective ones that have been pushed into a narrow space on social media, on YouTube and so on, or just a couple of channels. And today, the Turkish Radio and Television Board, which is sort of the regulatory organization, government watchdog in this sense, slapped fines on most of the channels that have been showing the opposition going to the streets and talking to street protesters and so on, most of the time on charges of incitement to hatred, which is a very loose definition that is often used, unfortunately, in these contexts. So that space is increasingly diminishing. But what's happening as far as the quality of Turkish democracy is concerned, while all these were taking place, and they're obviously quite problematic, one thing remained in Turkey, and that is elections, which had always been overwhelmingly credible. Problems were the exception, and the opposition would field its own candidate. The playing field would not be even, never has been,
Right.
particularly in the recent decade or so, because the governing party uses all of the advantages that it holds. But nevertheless, even under those circumstances, for example, in Istanbul, İmamoğlu was able to defeat the governing party twice. So you had that as sort of the North Star, at least in Turkish democracy. And that was the remaining hope that peaceful transition was still an option in this country. Now, what is being perceived is that Erdogan and the AK Party is trying to take out the candidate that could actually represent a credible challenge to him in the upcoming elections. So basically, he's trying to design the opposition in this manner. If that also occurs, then the quality of Turkish democracy descends to a further depth that it's never been before, and that would be very, very sad to see.
Yeah, and looking beyond Turkey, Turkey's obviously a major part of NATO, has been for a really long time, and it's also a partner with the EU. It's not a member, but it's supposedly one of
Candidate
the
country, yeah.
yeah, candidate country for the EU. So what has been the international reaction, if any? Has this affected their relationship with the EU or NATO, fellow NATO countries, or the US at all?
Yes and no. I mean, you have reactions here and there. There have been official statements coming out of the EU and out of countries like France, Germany, and some others. I haven't followed all of them. But at the same time, I would characterize them as being relatively muted, not forceful. But on the other hand, you have the foreign policy spokesperson of the opposition party yesterday. He was in an interview and he was saying, we're not looking for international support to this situation. We want you to see what's going on. We want you to understand it, but we are not asking for international support, because when we do, and if you do display support, then that also is used against us domestically. So there's an interesting fine line there. But, in this environment, you had the Turkish foreign minister visiting Washington, D.C. just 2 days ago. So in some ways, despite reactions here and there, and the Secretary of State Rubio, when talking about his meeting with the Turkish foreign minister, he spoke about all the issues they discussed. And at the very end, there was one sentence in which he said he expressed his concern about developments in Turkey. So I think it's palatable, the degree of pushback that is coming. But the real problem here, I think, for Turkey is this comes at a very unfortunate moment in time. It's unfortunate by all means anyway, but the
Right.
timing is additionally unfortunate for Turkey in the sense that Turkey's geopolitical value was on the rise because of developments in Ukraine and around Turkey, from the Middle East to Syria, and particularly after the Trump administration took power, the perception in Europe that the United States might retreat from Europe and Europe might need to, undertake its responsibilities more in terms of defense and security matters. That's an area where Turkey is a natural partner as a NATO ally, but also because it's a very capable country that can field capable, competent forces and capabilities. It has a defense industry that's been thriving. So that's an area where Turkey has a strong edge, in addition to its geopolitical strategic location. And there was increasing talk in Europe about how to plug Turkey into whatever type of a new security architecture that Europe would need to design, be it NATO-based or European-based, some form of European pillar. Now, this image of Turkey obviously makes that discussion much more difficult. But I think the bet on Erdogan's part and on the governing party's part is that the imperative to work with Turkey will override these concerns. And I think that's what they're seeing, basically, also with Washington.
Yeah, too important to not work with them with the issues that are going on right now and allowing Erdogan to sort of get away with some of these things, unfortunately. So, all right, Alper, always a good time. Unfortunately, not the most uplifting topic to chat about today, but I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Alper for his time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Headlines in History. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Theo Malhotra. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.